Hello, everyone. So we are picking up lecture 2 of lesson 31 with Nero becoming emperor in the year 54 CE. Um, so one helpful way of thinking about this is that, of course, when you have two young men who are potentially both are going to be interested in becoming emperors, it's quite likely that you would be thinking about, well, not both of them could live very long. One of them will get rid of the other. And what happens in the year 54, however, is something slightly more interesting insofar as Claudius at that point has already made Nero, the future emperor, a consul designate for the following year, and he is very much promoting him in power. However, supposedly in the year 54, he also makes it clear that when his slightly younger son, Britannicus, will reach that age, that he would do the same for him. And so we get the two guys who are both, by the way, younger than you, teenage young boys, if you wish, that essentially it will be partially the mothers who will fight it out. And so our historical records indicate that Agrippina, in fact, was involved in the killing of Claudius by poisoning. And that's how Nero was able to become emperor, as Britannicus was still just a tad too young to become emperor. So let's see how Suetonius describes this. So when the death of Claudius was made public, Nero, who was 17 years old, okay, think about how young, went forth to the watch between the 6th and the 7th hour, since no earlier time for the formal beginning of his reign seemed suitable because of bad omens throughout the day. Held emperor on the steps of the palace, he was carried in a litter to the Praetorian camp, and after a brief address to the soldiers was taken from there to the house, which he did not leave until evening, of the unbounded honors that were heaped upon him, refusing but one, the title of father of his country, and that because of his youth. Okay, so we find out that so Claudius is, of course, poisoned, and Nero, who is 17, will become emperor. So how do you do that? And so the soldiers already hail him emperor in front of the imperial palace. But the first place he goes to, and this is significant for us, is the Praetorian camp. So he's going to reach out to the bodyguards of emperors and probably promise them money. Second stop is the Senate House, where essentially the senators at that point are offering him all kind of honors, meaning whatever title essentially he might want to get, and he takes them all. Okay, so he's getting a lot of them. The only one he will not take is the father of the country, which at 17 I could see is a little bit problematic for him to be the father of the whole country that young. There is that sort of paternalistic image to this that he's just not quite able to feel at this time. But then, in a further show of hypocrisy and sort of the kind of feel of the Roman Empire in this period, is he does the following, and this is pretty interesting. Then, beginning with a display of filial piety, he gave Claudius a magnificent funeral, spoke his eulogy, and deified him. So let's just stop there. So Claudius is his stepfather, right? And he takes on the role. I'm going to sort of bury him, and I'm going to be the one who honors him with a eulogy at his funeral. And then he also makes him a god, thereby making himself a son of a god. And at the same time, it was Nero's mother who had Claudius killed. And I think that is just something that we want to keep an eye on throughout as we follow Nero's rule, is that, of course, you can just think that Nero comes from a terrible family and he is a terrible person. And biography as a genre might actually encourage you to have that perspective. But as we read along, and we will also take a little bit of a look at the historian Tacitus, I think you could also argue that although Nero is certainly not the lovely young man you want your friends to date, he is also living in a larger context in which imperial rule has created a deep sense of mistrust and abuse of power. And so the political context in which he takes power also contributes to our sense of Nero being such a bad emperor. At any rate, he left to his mother the management of all public and private business in this beginning. Indeed, on the first day of his rule, he gave to the tribune on guard a watchword, the best of mothers, and afterwards he often rode with her through the streets in her litter. So this is an interesting thing. So obviously he has to honor his poisoned stepfather, but then he also issues coins. And these early coins, and the watchword being the best mother, are really interesting because we see on this coin, on the left here is Nero, and on the right is Agrippina. We see that they are equal size. And usually this would be very, very unexpected that you would see a mother being quite so powerful, any female for that matter, that powerful. And we get the description, Agrippina Augusta, wife of the fight Claudius, mother of Nero Caesar, is sort of how Agrippina is described. That on this side, Nero's powers are described as, and in accordance with the decree of the Senate. So we get this strong sense of Agrippina's power in the early years of Nero's rule. And I think it's also helpful to think about Nero's early years, especially the first 5 so-called good years, as in fact very much under the guidance of older supportive individuals. And whether you like Agrippina or not, and people have a range of perspectives on her, Nero has 2 other people who are very, very helpful to him in these early years. And the first of those is the head of the Praetorian Guard by the name of Burrus, who is actually very close with Agrippina. And this is not depicting him. This is just a generic soldier image. We do not have a good depiction of Burrus. But as the head of the Praetorian Guard, he is definitely able to guarantee that Nero is able to use the soldiers and at the same time be in peace with the soldiers, and supports him just generally in any kind of military or policing aspect of his role. On the right here, we see an image of Seneca the Younger, who was his tutor for some years now, and who sort of comes along with him in these early years. And people again have mixed feelings about Seneca the Younger. Some people are very troubled by the fact that he supports Nero. He supposedly writes his speeches in these early years, but thereby what Seneca is able to accomplish, especially because he's a senator, is that he's able to generate a language of power that's comfortable enough for Roman senators also to live with. So one of the early works that Seneca publishes in Nero's reign is in fact called On Clemency, and it gives us a sense of how, from the perspective of someone who is not quite equal to an emperor, you might still be able to project an image of an emperor that is a good enough one for you as an underling. So what do I mean by that is that Seneca essentially says something along the lines of, Nero, you're fantastic. And look at these prior examples, for example, of Augustus and others, about how they did not abuse their power, thereby putting pressure on Nero not to abuse his power, not to kill people without trials and similar matters. So with the help of these 2 figures, the head of the Praetorian Guard, Burrus, and Nero's tutor, Seneca, we get the first 5 good years as a sort of very positive period of Nero, which people often forget because Nero ultimately goes down as such a bad figure in history. And the early rule, as described in Suetonius, to make his good intentions still more evident, he declared that he would rule according to the principles of Augustus, and he let slip no opportunity for acts of generosity and mercy, or even for displaying his affability, right? So we get a sense here of this sort of benefactions, right? Generosity as a key part of being a good emperor, and mercy, this is the clemency, this is the not taking advantage of the fact that everybody else is weaker than him. So let's see what else he did. The more oppressive sources of revenue, he either abolished or moderated, so no crazy taxation. Secondly, he reduced the rewards paid to informers against violators of the Papian law to 1/4 of the former amount. So this is something informers would get once they informed on you, depending of who exactly they inform on, but nevertheless he reduces that, thereby trying to sort of unmotivate informers to come, not to come forward. The hope is that there would be less of that kind of police society. Let's see, he distributed 400 sesterces to each man of the people, right? So this would be benefaction, and granted to the most distinguished of the senators who were without means an annual salary, to some as much as 500,000 sesterces. So even he is knight to some senators who do not have quite enough money to qualify for that rank in the society. And to the Praetorian cohorts, he gave a monthly allowance of grain free of costs, right? So this is now giving something to the troops in Rome. When he was asked, according to customs, to sign the warrant for the execution of a man condemned to death, he said, "How I wish I had never learned to write," right? So he wouldn't be able to sign. He greeted men of all orders offhand and from memory, so he remembers people's names, always a good way to become popular. When the Senate returned thanks to him, he replied, "When I shall have deserved them." So he's trying to say, like, no, you don't have to thank me for things. And he admitted even the comments to witness his exercises in the campus, and often declaimed in public. And so this idea here is actually sort of interesting, and we'll have to keep an eye on it, is that he has this desire to reach out to the public and become very popular with them, thereby creating a bit of a populist perspective that, you know, again, just an interesting problem to observe. Suetonius' section 19 suggests a turn for the verse. So he says, "I've brought together these acts of Nero, some of which are beyond criticism, while others are even deserving of no slight praise, to separate them from his shameful and criminal deeds, of which I shall proceed now to give an account." And I think what's sort of really interesting about this is that Nero goes down for his early years as a good emperor. And one little bit of this story that we don't hear much about is what happens to Britannicus, who you remember is the younger stepbrother. And in the year 55, so that is 1 year after he is becoming emperor, Britannicus, in fact, was killed. And so I think we get again this sense of, you know, there is no space for another young man who might want to become emperor. What's striking about this is that this does not raise an eyebrow. This, you know, first 5 good years, well, too bad. There was another young man who might have wanted to become emperor. Doesn't really destroy that. What happens at the end of the 5th year, the end of the first 5 good years, is the year 59, in which Nero will kill his mother. And I think this is a good moment for us to take a quick look at a description by Tacitus to give us a sense of what this might have looked like. So this is book 14. Then Nero, actually at that point, motivated by a woman he is interested in marrying, a lover. Because the woman wants to get married, and Agrippina is, no, absolutely not, you're married to Octavian, that's just what it is. Finally, Nero decided to kill her, that is Agrippina, debating only whether by poison, the dagger, or some other form of violence. Lovely options. First choice fell on poison, but if it was to be given at the imperial table, then the death could not be referred to chance, since Britannicus had already met a similar fate. Oh, the problems of being an emperor, pardon me. So finally, he is tries to kill her, by building a fake boat that collapses and she swims out. Like, we get all these sort of crazy stories about his sort of repeated attempts to kill her, until finally he sent some executioners to surround her bedroom. And one of those officers began by striking her on the head with a club. And then the centurion was drawing his sword to make an end. When she preferred her wound to the blow, "Strike here," she exclaimed, and was dispatched with repeated wounds, with a very theatrical moment in which she points at her wound and that she wants to be heard there, with the point being that that's the wound from which Nero emerged. On Tacitus's description of sort of the immediate aftermath is really interesting in 1410, but only with the completion of the crime was its magnitude realized by the Caesar. His first encouragement to hope came from the adoration of the centurions and tribunes, as at the suggestion of Burrus. This is, remember, Burrus, the good guy, the head of the Praetorian Guard. They grasped his hand and wished him joy of escaping his unexpected danger and the criminal enterprise of his mother. So the point is that they will create an alternative story. So this is how power goes, in which Nero supposedly was under the threat of his mother's conspiracy against him. So Nero withdrew to Naples and forwarded to the Senate a letter, the sum of which was that an assassin with his weapon upon him had been discovered, one of the confidential freedmen of Agrippina, and that his mistress, conscious of her guilt, had paid the penalty of meditated murder. Right. So the idea is that Agrippina tried to use one of her freedmen to kill Nero. The end of the first 5 years, therefore, marks a turning point in which Nero now turns out to be a much more manipulative and oppressive ruler. But notice also how in Tacitus's description, people go along with it still, including Burrus, supposedly good guy, who was a friend of Agrippina, in fact. And this is where the scary music starting to play. And this is where we are going to pick up in a future lesson.